The Mulligan, a concept that has existed in collectible card games for as long as they've existed. Interestingly enough though, the term most likely originated in a more conventional sport, golf. However, it quickly found a home in gaming culture, in the fantasy wargame Titan. I think most of us, myself included, know the Mulligan from Magic the Gathering, but Titan did it first, and a good 10 years ahead at that. The 1982 version of the game introduced the first move Mulligan, a mulligan whereby a player could re-roll the first move. In fact, Magic the Gathering didn't even release with a mulligan in the original rules, reportedly because some of their playtest group believed the concept would reward poor deck building. We'll get into that discussion later, don't worry. Anyway, it wasn't until 1994 when the first mulligan rule was introduced to Magic. The original mulligan, aka all land, no land, allowed a player to redraw their hand if, you guessed it, they either had all land cards or no land cards. Now, I could go into more detail about the evolution of the mulligan in Magic. However, other creators have done that already, and that's not really what this video is about. However, it's good to know that as of 2020, Magic has employed the London Mulligan, where a player may draw a full hand each time they redraw, but they put a card back for each mulligan they've taken. Before we go any further, I'd like to clarify that I am a YuGiOh player, for better or worse. I do occasionally play other TCGs, and have done so quite a bit in the past, so while my general knowledge is decent, I can't offer much insight into other games' mulligan systems outside the context of this video. For now, I want to talk about what potential mulligan could mean for YuGiOh, and my thoughts on the mechanic in the context of the YuGiOh TCG. The basic idea behind the mulligan in Magic is trading card advantage for overall hand quality. As a YuGiOh player, I can definitely say there's been situations where I've had card advantage, but lacked the ability to do much with it. Provided you've built your deck well, gambling away the one or two cards for a better line of play is a pretty fair trade-off. Whether it's attributed to Magic or not, we can see the mulligan being used in numerous other card games. Another example I like to touch on is Pokémon TCG, but we also see it in games such as Hearthstone. In Pokémon, a player may mulligan their hand if they don't open a basic Pokémon. In YuGiOh, this could be equated to a starter card. For each mulligan a player takes, their opponent gets to draw one additional card in their starting hand. So Pokemon employs a similar mentality to Magic, although in Pokemon it's not really optional. The last major example I like to touch on, as I mentioned before, is the digital card game Hearthstone. In Hearthstone, both players can pick which individual cards from their opening hand to shuffle back, then they draw a new one for each card shuffled away. However, this can only be done once. While having the option to pick and choose which cards stay and which cards are exchanged is really powerful, you only get one chance to do it. So it's about weighing up how useful your cards are, and it's worth gambling them away when you could always just draw something less useful. This type of mulligan is a much more high risk, high power mulligan, but the power is capped by the game's mana system. So firstly, I want to highlight some examples we've talked about and what makes those games different to YuGiOh. And that is that Magic, Hearthstone, and Pokemon are resource-based games. I can't pretend like I'm an expert in all of these card games, and there's definitely card games that will break this rule, but as a general rule, the mulligan finds its home in resource-based card games. Something that doesn't work as well in the YuGiOh TCG, a game with a much higher ceiling. What I mean by this is that in YuGiOh, compared to games like Magic, there is significantly more that you can do in a single turn. In resource-based games, you're limited to how much of the given resource you can spend on making plays. In YuGiOh, the cards themselves dictate how much you can do. Already, I think it's apparent why a mulligan mechanic of some kind could drastically alter, if not break, YuGiOh. Having the ability to shuffle back a hand that doesn't get to your deck's desired endboard changes so much. First of all, in a situation where both players are more likely to draw their optimal hand, the player who goes first is much more likely to win the game, especially when cards like Crossout Designator and Call by the Grave exist. Let's use something like the London Mulligan from Magic as an example. In a deck like Rickus Navalon, a hand of just Crossout Designator and Sunseed Genius Loci is able to build a significant endboard through interruption. So you could go all the way down to just 2 cards and guarantee a line of play. Not only does this make already card efficient decks like Ricka more consistent, but in doing so, decks like Salamangreat or Runic variants, decks which have to invest more resources to set up, get left behind in the dust. While a Ricker player could mulligan away and risk going down to just 2 cards in this example, a Runic or Salamangreat player has 1, maybe 2 mulligans at best before their hand becomes almost unplayable, never mind through both hand traps and interruptions. Now, this is using the London Mulligan as an example for some of these issues, but what if YuGiOh was to implement a similar system to that of Pokémon? As I mentioned earlier, in the Pokémon TCG, the mulligan isn't optional. It's something that happens if your hand doesn't meet specific requirements. Earlier on, I equated a basic Pokémon to a starter in YuGiOh, but this isn't really a fair comparison. It works on a vague level, but the reality is, YuGiOh is significantly more convoluted. You could say, for example, that a starter equates to a monster that can be normal summoned or set. But then there's the issue of decks that don't really use their normal summon, or play very few, such as Drytron. While we're on the point, cards like Ash Blossom, a hand trap, can be normal summoned, but in most cases you'd never want to. You could say that if you open no spell cards, but then decks like Super Heavy Samurai that typically don't even run spell cards wouldn't have a spell card. I think you get the idea. Pokemon is a lot more structured in the way it plays and what roles cards fulfill, so it's much easier to say, if you don't open with X, then you have to draw a new hand. This just simply wouldn't work in a game as complex and diverse as YuGiOh. Not to mention, it would only limit future card design choices. Had a rule like this been in place, we would likely never have seen certain archetypes rise to power. Paleozoic, Super Heavy Samurai, or Runic, just to name a couple of possibilities. Realistically, a system like this can only work in a game like Pokémon or Magic, where certain cards are more defined and serve a more explicit purpose, such as land cards or basic Pokémon. However, could a system like Hearthstone work? In Hearthstone, the player gains 1 additional mana, the game's main resource, each turn, and it's important to stay on the curve of advantage. This means that you want to use all your mana each turn to ensure you steadily keep up with your opponent and develop your own strategy. So it makes sense that the mulligan rule in Hearthstone works the way it does. You have 1 opportunity to redraw specific cards in your hand. So if you open a hand with 3 cards, and they all cost 3 mana, you can choose to shuffle back 2 of them in the hopes of drawing a card that costs 1 or 2 mana. This is a system that works well in a game with a defined mana curve. YuGiOh doesn't have a defined mana curve or tempo. Touching back on the previous point, the turn ceiling is defined by your hand and little else. So in a world where YuGiOh was to employ a similar mulligan system as Hearthstone, we face a similar problem as we've discussed with the other examples. Let's look at a theoretical branded hand. In Branded, you typically play lots of ways to get to Branded Fusion and Branded Lost, in order to make sure the Branded Fusion resolves. So if you open a hand that contains a hand trap, a brick, a board breaker and 2 Alibars, you can now shuffle back the brick and your second copy of Alibar to dig for access to Branded Loss, or additional Branded Fusions to play through hand traps. Depending on your matchup, you can even afford to shuffle back one of your interruptions. Using a system like this, the branded player has a significantly higher chance of opening everything they need to resolve their combo uninterrupted. For decks that operate on 2 or more engines, this kind of mulligan will drastically increase the odds of accessing both engines in their deck. So, let's talk about some of the more general issues that I think would arise with any kind of mulligan rule in YuGiOh. I think the biggest clash comes with the forbidden and limited list. Many cards get limited or semi-limited rather than being outright banned in YuGiOh. This allows players to still use the cards, but decreases the odds of a player seeing them. In a world where YuGiOh has a mulligan, the concept of limiting or semi-limiting cards becomes a bit more redundant. You have a second or even third chance of drawing into a card that is at 1 copy, or a card that can get you to it. It doesn't really matter if the card is at 1, 2, or 3 legal copies, because you become so much more likely to see it with a big mulligan system. This means that if they wanted to limit the use of a card in most cases, they'd have to outright ban it. And while in some cases this is necessary, I don't think the player base wants to see a huge wave of bans of some fan favourite cards. Consider a card like Reinforcement to the Army. At 1, this card is an extra copy of any warrior monster in your deck. For example, a 4th copy of Neospatian Connector. This card has been run as a staple of almost every deck that runs level 4 or lower warrior monsters. With a Mulligan system, on top of being able to see reinforcements of the army, a really powerful card, you're also more likely to see the target that you want to search with reinforcements of the army, multiplying the likelihood of you seeing your perfect starter card like Neospatian Connector, making cards like reinforcements of the army potentially really toxic under a Mulligan system. In YuGiOh, we quite often use the phrase Saki for something that's luck-based. Deck building itself would become sackier, playing many more inconsistent and more powerful 1 or 2 of cards and engines in the hopes that you can just mulligan into what you need to make them work. This includes playing more bricks, as you can just get rid of the additional bricks. Your limited power cards, such as 1 for 1, Monster Reborn, and other cards like that would see increased amounts of play. And in general, I think the pace of the game would only increase, potentially phasing out some trap decks altogether. And as much as I'm a big advocate for combo decks in YuGiOh, I don't think everyone wants to see all combo decks all the time. YuGiOh is one of the few card games that works best without a mulligan mechanic. I know that we've all had those hands, those atrocious hands, that are less likely than winning the lottery. We've cursed the game for our terrible luck, and then gone on to play other card games where you can just shuffle back your hand for free. But in reality, those hands are kind of necessary in YuGiOh. If we could just shuffle away every bad hand we drew, YuGiOh would be a lot less expressive, especially in deck building, and honestly, less interesting. I think on the whole, the game would just get quite stale. We all know the pain of watching our opponent combo off for 10 minutes without interruption, but we also experience the joy and the pride of dismantling an insurmountable board by making the best of what we drew. And I think a mulligan would only make the former more common and the latter much, much rarer. Personally, I wouldn't want that. My favourite feeling in this game is my opponent sets up a huge board, and I meticulously break through it, analysing every little play. That's my favourite thing to do in YuGiOh, and I think it's one of the unique things about YuGiOh that I don't think I'd like to lose. But for now, let's enjoy what makes YuGiOh unique, and just be glad we don't have a mulligan system.